He has damning claims of numerous unethical and/or unlawful practices committed by senior Halo Studios representatives.
Time Halo series art director Glenn Israel posted an explosive two-part accusation of his former employer on LinkedIn last Saturday, accusing the studio's leadership of catastrophic mismanagement that includes fraud, blacklisting, and harassment.
As I to former Halo art director's claims, I'm left questioning what else Microsoft didn't want one to.
Glenn Israel was the art director at Halo Studios, multiplayer art director, interim studio art director, lead on an unannounced project. 3 roles simultaneously, all carrying full visibility across departments, pipelines, personnel decisions, and leadership behavior. When he published a 2-part LinkedIn post in April 2026, detailing what he witnessed and personally experienced between January 2024 and June 2025, Microsoft's gaming empire did not just face a PR problem, it faced something considerably more serious. A credible, legally grounded, corroborated account of an institutional culture that allegedly ran harassment as standard practice, weaponized HR against the people it was supposed to protect, and used layoffs as cover to eliminate employees who had filed formal complaints. And when Microsoft was given the opportunity to deny any of it, they issued a statement saying the company does not comment on individual employee matters. In the context of what Israel documented, that silence is its own kind of statement. Start with who Glenn Israel actually is, because the weight of these allegations depends entirely on understanding the position from which he made them. He started at Bungie in 2008 as a concept artist, the beginning of what would become one of the longest tenures in Halo's development history. When Microsoft acquired the Halo IP and Bungie separated to pursue independent development, Israel crossed over to 343 industries. End quote. He did not leave with Bungie, he stayed with Halo. He climbed the creative ranks, eventually reaching art director on Halo Infinite, the most ambitious, most troubled Halo release in the franchise's history.
Director Glenn Israel announced that after 17 years, he would be, quote, no longer contributing to the Halo universe. And it's quite rough. He warned other devs about the risks of being taken advantage of by the industry, and he said he would share this particular story in its entirety when it is absolutely safe to.
He survived the 2023 layoffs that cut deep into 343's creative staff. He was present for the studio's rebrand to Halo Studios in 2024, with its promises of new culture, new engine, and new creative direction. He was simultaneously carrying the multiplayer art director role, the interim studio art director role, and the lead position on an unannounced project when the events he describes began unfolding. This was not someone on the periphery of the organization looking in. This was someone at the center of it, with full institutional visibility. When a person at that level comes forward with documented allegations, the question is not whether they had access to what they are describing. The question is whether what they are describing actually happened. Israel's answer to that question is structured with the precision of someone who anticipated exactly how Microsoft's legal and communications teams would respond. He did not make general claims about a toxic culture or vague accusations about bad management. He specified a time frame: January 2024 to June 2025. He specified categories of misconduct: blacklisting, fraud, rampant favoritism, and cronyism, manifesting as deliberate interference with hiring decisions and career advancement. Multiple harassment campaigns designed to provoke what he named, using its precise legal term, constructive discharge. He specified actors: senior Halo Studios representatives, global employee relations representative, a global employee relations director. He specified dates, sequences of events, and the institutional responses that followed each complaint he filed. This is the documentary structure of someone who has consulted legal counsel and understands exactly what standard of specificity is required for allegations to be taken seriously rather than dismissed. The legal term constructive discharge is the one that deserves the most careful attention in everything Israel wrote. It is not a casual phrase. It is not indication for a difficult workplace. Constructive discharge is the specific legal concept that describes a situation where an employer makes an employee's working conditions so deliberately and systematically unbearable through harassment, marginalization, false characterization of their work, stripping of responsibilities, or coordinated social pressure that the employee has no reasonable choice but to resign. The employer never fires the person. The employer never creates a paper trail that says termination. The employer simply makes continuing to work there psychologically and professionally untenable until the employee concludes that leaving is the only viable option. The company keeps its hands technically clean. The employee disappears. No wrongful termination claim, no severance dispute attached to a firing. The problem solves itself from the company's perspective, at significant personal and professional cost to the individual. Israel is alleging that Halo Studios' senior leadership ran constructive discharge as standard operating procedure against employees they had identified as unwanted employees who, critically, were not in poor standing professionally. His specific language was that these were employees who otherwise were in good standing, people who were doing their jobs, people who had not failed performance reviews or violated workplace policies, people who had simply become inconvenient to the leadership structure for reasons that had nothing to do with their professional performance. The mechanism for removing them was not performance management. It was coordinated harassment designed to make staying unbearable. If true, that is not a management failure. That is a deliberate institutional strategy for workforce control that operates entirely outside the formal processes designed to protect employees from exactly that kind of treatment. What happened when Israel tried to use the formal protection systems is the part of his account that shifts this story from a workplace dispute into something with broader implications for how Microsoft manages institutional accountability. In June 2025, Israel filed formal complaints with Microsoft's Human Resources Division. The complaints were documented. They named specific actors. They described specific events. They followed the process that employees are told to follow when they experience what Israel was doing. The response he received on first contact from a senior global employee relations representative was not an acknowledgement. It was not a case number. It was not a promise of review. It was a threat. A direct, explicit threat of retaliation and a statement that any further investigation would be shut down on first contact, before any review had been conducted, before any evidence had been examined. The institutional reflex at the level of the person whose job was to receive and investigate exactly this kind of complaint was to threaten the person who filed it. By July 2025, the same individual is alleged to have falsely closed. Further reports, Israel had submitted closing complaints as resolved that had not been genuinely investigated, marking cases as out of scope that fell squarely within the parameters of what Microsoft's own HR processes are supposed to address. Following the filing of those complaints, a concentrated 4-day harassment campaign took place, an orchestrated sequence of events that Israel describes as a deliberate attempt to manufacture grounds for his termination. The critical institutional detail is that Microsoft's own business conduct and compliance team and workplace investigation team were aware of what was happening during those 4 days, and failed to take appropriate action. This was not harassment that slipped under the institutional radar. It was harassment that occurred in full institutional visibility without triggering the responses that visibility was supposed to generate. In August 2025, Israel's art team was reassigned away from the unannounced project he had been leading. His role was then formally characterized as redundant. He describes this characterization as plainly retaliatory, a direct consequence of having filed complaints and having refused to stay silent. The role did not become redundant because the business no longer needed it. The role became redundant because the person in it had made himself institutionally inconvenient by using the complaint systems that were supposed to protect him. He left the studio in October 2025. He signed the severance agreement after reaching the conclusion that the internal investigation processes had been rendered entirely meaningless. The investigation that was eventually escalated to a director reportedly refused to examine the original complaints that had triggered everything, declined to interview key witnesses Israel had identified, and focused exclusively on a narrow window of events that allowed the broader pattern to remain unexamined. That is not an investigation. That is a performance of one designed to produce a predetermined outcome. One of the explicit legal violations Israel cites involves a Washington State Statute, RCW 49.12.250, which requires employers to provide employees with access to their own personnel files upon request. Israel alleges Microsoft contravened this law and has not met its penalty obligation. The inclusion of this specific statutory citation is significant not primarily because of the individual violation it describes, but because of what it signals about how Israel documented everything else. When someone going through what he describes takes the time to identify the specific Washington State Code being violated, to cite it by number in a public post, and to note the penalty obligation attached to it, they are not operating from memory and emotion. They are operating from documentation and legal preparation. Every other allegation in his post exists within that same framework of deliberate, legally grounded precision. He also articulates the broader structural accusation about how Microsoft's HR architecture operates. His characterization is that the system is deliberately compartmentalized to obscure responsibility and create plausible deniability. No single authority clearly accountable for any outcome. Every complaint passed between handlers. Every investigation delegated to someone whose scope conveniently excludes the most significant elements. Every closure attributed to a process rather than a decision made by a named individual. The result is that a coordinated campaign of institutional harassment can run through an organization without ever producing a clear chain of command that can be traced back to the people who authorized it. This is not the description of a bureaucracy that became dysfunctional through growth and complexity. This is the description of a bureaucracy that was architected to function exactly this way, to give leadership the ability to take consequential actions against employees while maintaining the institutional cover of having followed proper process at every step. After Israel's LinkedIn posts went public, something happened that transformed the story from a single employee's account into a documented pattern. Multiple former employees came forward with their own experiences. A former producer stated they had spoken directly with studio leadership, who expressed a desire to fire every single artist in the building, and that this was stated bluntly, not implied or inferred. A former business executive partner stated plainly that harassment and retaliation were not isolated incidents at Halo Studios. They were the experienced reality of working there, something that happened to them personally. Tyler Davis, who worked 9 years across the studio, added that leadership definitely did a lot of people dirty to cover up mistakes, and that the management culture operated as what he described as a good old boys club of backstabbing, where accountability flowed downward but never reached the people making decisions. Israel himself confirmed that none of these accounts surprised him. He had witnessed similar behavior within the studio art department repeatedly. The pattern these former employees described matched what he had personally observed and experienced closely enough that their accounts were, in his assessment, entirely credible. When a primary accuser receives corroboration not from one additional voice, but from multiple former employees describing the same organizational dynamics from their own independent experiences, the evidentiary picture changes. It stops being one person's characterization of events they experienced and starts being a documented pattern of institutional behavior that multiple people across different roles and time periods encountered consistently. The detail about studio leadership wanting to fire every single artist connects to something larger happening across the games industry that gives the internal politics at Halo Studios a structural context. The push to remove the artist layer from game development aligns directly with the industry-wide shift toward AI-assisted creative pipelines and automated content generation workflows. The business case for reducing human creative staff is being built across the industry simultaneously, with AI tools being positioned as capable of handling asset generation, environmental design, and creative iteration at a fraction of the cost of maintaining large human art teams. If leadership at Halo Studios was openly discussing firing every artist, they were not expressing an unusual opinion in the current games industry. They were expressing, perhaps earlier and more bluntly than most, a calculation that an increasing number of gaming executives are making quietly. Zoom out to what has actually happened to Halo as a franchise during the period when the alleged internal dysfunction was operating. Halo Infinite launched in December 2021 with significant content missing from the promised feature set. The player base declined faster than almost any live service game of comparable scale and investment. The live service component was effectively abandoned before delivering on its core promises. Millions of fans who had waited years for a return to form for the franchise received a game that felt incomplete and was then left to stagnate. The human cost and the product failure were happening simultaneously, driven by the same leadership structure. Employees who watched this unfold reported being furious when internal communications from Phil Spencer celebrated record Xbox profitability while announcing the layoffs that followed the Infinite disappointment. The message that the financial machinery was working well while the people who built the product lost their jobs captured something about the institutional priorities that no official communication ever addressed directly. The studio was rebranded from 343 Industries to Halo Studios in 2024, with explicit promises of cultural change. A new name, a new engine, Unreal Engine, replacing the proprietary Slipspace framework. A new creative direction signaled as the beginning of a genuine reset for the franchise. Israel's documented timeline of misconduct runs from January 2024 through the summer of 2025. That means every event he describes, the harassment campaigns, the HR retaliation, the manufactured redundancies, the fake investigations, occurred inside this officially proclaimed new era. The rebrand changed the external presentation. It did not change who was making decisions or how those decisions were enforced against employees who pushed back. The new name on the door was applied to the same institutional culture operating underneath it. Microsoft's response to Israel's detailed, legally structured, multiply corroborated account was a statement from an Xbox spokesperson that the company does not comment on individual employee matters. In isolation, that is a standard corporate response to a personnel dispute. In the context of what Israel documented, a 7-year veteran, an art director, someone who held 3 simultaneous leadership roles, supported by multiple former employees, describing the same patterns from their own experience. That response is a calculated choice with specific legal and communications logic behind it. Issuing a denial creates a legally discoverable statement that can be challenged with the documentation Israel describes having. Issuing a specific response risks implicitly validating the framework of his allegations by engaging with them on their own terms. Silence avoids both risks. It creates no new legal exposure. It generates no statement that can be contradicted. But in the court of public perception, institutional silence paired with multiply corroborated allegations from a credible long-tenure insider reads exactly the way Israel likely intended it to read. Not as denial. As absence of denial. The broader damage radiates outward from Halo Studios, in ways that threaten the strategic premise of Microsoft's entire gaming acquisition strategy. Over the past several years, Microsoft assembled the largest portfolio of gaming studios ever brought under a single corporate umbrella. Activision Blizzard, Bethesda, Obsidian, Playground Games, Ninja Theory, dozens of creative organizations acquired on the promise that Microsoft would be a responsible, supportive, trustworthy steward of the creative talent and IP they were absorbing. That promise was the justification for the regulatory approvals, the public positioning, and the creative talent that chose to stay rather than depart when their studios were acquired. The entire strategic premise rests on Microsoft being able to demonstrate that joining Xbox is good for creative organizations and the people inside them. If the flagship studio, the one built around the franchise that literally launched Xbox as a platform, the franchise that is synonymous with Microsoft gaming in a way that nothing else in the portfolio approaches, is the documented site of alleged coordinated retaliation, manufactured redundancies, fake HR investigations, and leadership that openly discussed eliminating entire creative departments, then the promise Microsoft made to every other studio it acquired and every studio it hopes to acquire in the future is visibly not being kept. Senior creative talent inside other Microsoft-owned studios is reading Israel's account and making calculations about their own situations. Developers considering signing with Xbox are reading it and making calculations about what that commitment actually means for their careers and their safety. The industry is watching. And what it is seeing is a company that responded to detailed allegations from a credible, long-tenure insider with a statement about not commenting on individual employee matters. Israel concluded his posts with a direct warning to anyone in the industry considering seeking employment at the organization. He said he could not, in good conscience, recommend it. He said, "Employees are simply not safe there." That is a sentence that carries enormous weight when it comes from someone who spent 17 years inside the institution, someone who built their professional identity around it, who survived every upheaval it went through, who stayed when others left, and who only departed after concluding that the internal protection systems were structurally incapable of doing what they were supposed to do. He is not saying the creative work is bad or the intellectual property is exhausted. He is saying the institution cannot be trusted to protect the human beings working inside it. That distinction matters enormously. IP can be revived. Creative direction can be reset. An institution that has allegedly built deliberate mechanisms for neutralizing employees who use the complaint systems that are supposed to protect them is a different and harder problem. Because the mechanism Israel describes compartmentalized HR architecture, designed to produce plausible deniability while allowing coordinated retaliation to proceed, does not fix itself with a rebrand. It does not resolve with a new engine or a cultural reset announcement. It requires the kind of structural accountability that Microsoft's response to these allegations suggests they are not currently prepared to provide. The question Israel's account leaves hanging over Microsoft's gaming empire is not limited to Halo Studios. If this is what was happening inside the franchise that Microsoft's gaming identity was built on, inside the studio that received the most institutional attention and the highest profile rebrand, during a period officially described as a new era of cultural renewal, then the question that every developer inside every other Microsoft studio and every creative professional considering an Xbox deal is now asking is the one that Microsoft's silence does nothing to answer. If it happened there, what else is happening elsewhere? And who is next to speak?